The 33 candles. I hope you won't ask for too many explanations because I don't have them. What I'm about to tell you happened in a 150-year-old house where something ancient was awakened, something that has hunted my family one by one. I wish I understood. Do you have theories about all this madness? God knows I've tried to make sense of it. My family, I have to say, is insultingly boring. Not in a bad way, quite the opposite. This absence of problems gave us an extremely peaceful life. We're not rich, but we've never lacked anything. We don't have luxurious vacations, but we can visit family at least once a year. My parents have a happy marriage, not much to tell. For a long time, Miguel thought we all lived such simple lives. At the beginning of 2014, I discovered this wasn't the case. And that's where this story begins. Everything was triggered by a photography project. I had to choose someone in my family, photograph them and their environment to try to capture the essence of their personality. Thinking of something interesting, I asked my grandfather, Don Francisco. Although my grandparents were as ordinary as we were, their 150-year-old house was a character in itself. At least that's what I thought then. I took some photos of my grandfather, and then it was time to eat. It was Saturday, and my grandmother, Doña Elena, had made chicken soup. I was glad I had visited them. I politely told her that her chicken soup was very good, and from then on she thought it was my favorite dish. Whenever she knew I would be visiting, she prepared it for me. That's how sweet she was. Suddenly there was a commotion in the street. A young man had tried to break into an old man's house near the corner. He didn't count on the fact that all the old man's sons were there that day. They chased him and were beating him badly right in front of my grandparents' house. My grandfather, an extremely sensible man, went out and asked them to wait for the police. After all, there's always doubt whether someone steals because they like easy money or out of genuine need. That's what he always told us. I wanted to go out, but my grandmother stopped me, asking me to wait inside, and I had to stay listening to the shouting behind those enormous wooden doors. The house looked more like a convent or an old hotel than a house, but it had always belonged to the family. From the main entrance opening onto the street, there were two corridors, one to the left, leading to the bedrooms, and one to the right, leading to the kitchen, dining room, and living room. In the center was a door leading to a small central garden with an angel fountain that, for as long as I can remember, has caused me a lot of fear. I decided to ignore the commotion and continue with the photography assignment. I approached the angel, as always, with some nervousness and took some photos. The light at that moment was perfect, and suddenly, in the blurred background through the camera, I saw someone walk past toward my grandparents' bedrooms. I lowered the camera and saw nothing more, but decided to check that area of the house usually closed to visitors. My grandparents, for some reason, always slept in separate rooms, one door facing the other at the end of the corridor, and at the end, facing both doors, was the entrance to a small storeroom that I had never entered. I thought perhaps it was time to do so. From conversations I had heard, I understood that they kept photographs and old things there, that my mother had once used it as a studio, and among other things, they kept the items that the previous inhabitants of the house had left over more than 100 years. When I approached the door, I can't explain how, but I felt as if someone was calling me from inside, and at the same time as if someone was pushing me in the chest, as if to prevent me from getting closer. "Miguel!" The sound of someone calling my name behind my back froze the blood in my veins. Startled, I only felt hands grabbing my shoulders, and I screamed before realizing it was my grandmother. She had never scolded me so much. She said she wouldn't tell my grandfather, but she even asked me to leave the house immediately. She never made chicken soup for me on any subsequent visits. It hurt me more than I thought. At the end of that year, she died without having forgiven me, and I was still left not understanding what I had done to make her so angry. She died on December 23rd, and on the night of the 24th, while families around were celebrating, my family was also gathered, but for another reason at the funeral home. We talked among cousins, remembering grandmother. Mainly, several of us of about the same age gathered the four of us who were in high school at that time. Amid the memories I recounted for the first time that conflict with my grandmother, that innocent invasion of her privacy that cost me my relationship with her in those final months. All agreed that it wasn't such a big deal. Suddenly the voice of Lucia, a 12-year-old cousin who we thought was asleep lying on her brother's lap, said something that would only complicate what I felt. She confessed that she had accidentally seen the interior of that permanently closed room since she could remember. According to her, it was completely covered with religious figures, and in the center of the room was a round table full of lit candles. We didn't believe her. If there was anything about our grandparents, it was that they weren't at all concerned with religious figures and didn't educate any of their children in either the Catholic or Protestant religion in which they were raised in their families. We told her she must have been confused, that she imagined it, that she was making it up. But her answer was clear. She said, with her eyes still closed as if sleeping, "If you don't believe me, go see it now while the house is empty." We weren't far from the house, just 5 or 6 blocks away. So we decided to go and end our curiosity. We told our parents we were going for a snack and asked grandfather if he needed anything from his house. Still very grieved, he just shook his head and continued looking at the coffin, motionless. We walked at a quick pace and for some reason almost in silence. I felt a hole in my stomach and wanted to tell them to forget about it, that I didn't care, although deep down I wanted to know what had made my grandmother so angry with me. I'm not sure if there was no light in the street that night or if everyone had decided to go spend Christmas Eve elsewhere, but my grandparents' street seemed more deserted than all others, darker than all. We entered the house and turned on the light. The silence was such that I could hear the light bulb buzzing. We nervously headed down the hallway to the room. When I looked at that angel in the courtyard that had always terrified me, this time I saw it looking directly at me. I don't know if it was the dim light coming in and my nerves, but I could barely see its face, and instead of its smile, what I saw on that face was an expression of terror or anger with its mouth completely open. Or at least, that's what I could guess in the darkness that covered it. Before I could think about what I thought I had just seen, we were standing in front of the door of that room, my 4 cousins, Diego, Javier, Rafael, and me. We opened the door and found exactly the image Lucia had described minutes before from floor to ceiling. The room was covered with religious images of all kinds. We didn't even find the light switch, but the light from the candles on that round wooden table in the center, painted a horrible sky blue, surely a long time ago, illuminated enough to discover even Hindu images in some corner of the wall. All of us went around the room trying to discover what it meant, but while they, my cousins, argued, I could only focus on one candle that was about to be completely consumed. The large wooden door creaked. Someone had arrived at the house. I ran out to the corridor from where I could see the entrance and the courtyard. It was my grandfather. I ran to tell the others. We ran out on tiptoe when we saw the corridor light turn on, and now he was just a few meters away and about to see us. Javier and Rafael barely managed to enter my grandfather's room. I lost sight of Diego and had to enter my grandmother's room trying to close the door without making absolutely any noise. If she, my grandmother, who was all sweetness, had been so angry with me, I couldn't imagine what my grandfather would do if he realized that while we were watching over his wife, we had betrayed his trust. My grandfather's slow steps approached until they stopped in front of the door I was pressed against, trying to listen. Suddenly I thought he might have come to the house for something of my grandmother's, or that he would enter her room to remember her or something, and I quickly threw myself to the floor to get under the bed. He opened one of the other doors. I didn't hear when he was about to enter my grandmother's room. I barely managed to hide from his feet walking to the center of the room, and I saw him kneel down. I thought he had managed to see me, that he would kneel down and pull me out from under the bed in fury. But he only put his hand in, trying to find something. He passed his hand very close to my face, but fortunately didn't touch me. When he touched a shoebox, he pulled it out and then left the room. He closed the door. I heard footsteps in the hallway, the front door close, and then he left. A while later, Diego came to get me. He had to hide under the table of candles. He didn't have time to do anything else. He saw my grandfather come in with a candle lighted, leave it, and then leave. When I entered, I noticed that he had replaced the candle that was about to go out, the one I had been focusing on. There were 33 candles on that table in a shape I wouldn't know how to describe. It wasn't something I'd seen before, but it was too precise to be coincidental. Even more tormented with questions. What was going on in that room? Why did my grandfather take the time to go change a candle while his wife was being watched over? Why did none of them, not even their last children to have used that room for other things, seem to have any idea what had led my grandparents to make it so forbidden in recent times? When my grandfather's health suddenly declined in August 2015, the last thing I thought of was questioning about this. As suddenly as he arrived at the hospital, he died, and the family almost rejoiced that he would be reunited with grandmother. Diego was the last person who could talk to him, according to my mother, when I arrived at the hospital. While my uncles passed through as they arrived, my cousin suddenly entered to see him. After a few minutes, he left the room, and by the time my Uncle Roberto went in, my grandfather was already gone. I found it curious that it was precisely Diego, the most rebellious, who was the last to see him. He had always been quite distant from everyone, but when he was 14, he confessed to the whole family that he was gay. We cousins, especially those closest, had already suspected it, and perhaps due to our age, accepted it without problems. But there were some uncles who, for some stupid reason, even stopped talking to him. It was the grandparents, from whom we least expected it, who ended up supporting him the most. So something in me felt it was right that he had the opportunity to hear grandfather's last words. However, minutes later I ran into Diego and knew the truth about it, and I hugged him. We both had tears in our eyes. He asked me to accompany him to our grandparents' house. I asked what was happening, and he said he couldn't explain it here in the hospital. I asked him to wait for Javier, who was about to arrive, but he said there was no time. We ran out, and he drove like I'd never seen him drive before to the house. On the way, Diego told me everything. It wasn't a coincidence. My grandfather wanted to talk to him when he felt he didn't have much strength left. Through what Diego thought were incoherences, he clearly told him that he had seen him hiding under the table in the candle room when he had to hide. He repeated to Diego that it wasn't his fault or grandmother's, and that they had to keep the 33 candles lit. It's not your fault nor grandmother's, and you have to keep the 33 candles lit. He repeated again and again were his last words. Before that, he had asked him to leave right then to make sure they didn't go out, and that's exactly why we came to that house. Although Diego said I didn't have to do it, I was convinced I had to be there too. I went in with him, and despite it still being early inside the house, even the courtyard seemed to be growing darker and darker. I couldn't help but look at that angel, but I lowered my gaze. This time we ran to the candle room. There were several about to go out, but one had completely disappeared. Diego asked me to help him find more candles, and I remembered the shoebox under grandmother's bed. I left the room, and suddenly at the end of the corridor, the figure of a girl with an almost alert posture was looking toward us. Like the previous time with the angel, there was something completely covering her, making her just a silhouette and not letting me see her face clearly. A very strange darkness. I began to gradually become paralyzed, as I understood and began to accept that this was not one of my cousins, not a neighbor, not anything similar. I was seeing something that for some reason I knew was related to the room behind me. That silhouette of a girl suddenly ran towards me. I also ran in the same direction, but to throw myself into my grandmother's room, take the box, and run back to the candle room. We lit the missing candle, replaced the others that were about to go out, and counted again to make sure there were 33. Suddenly a sound like a deep sigh seemed to come from all over the room, but we had no idea what had just happened. We called Javier, and he arrived shortly after accompanied by Raphael and Lucia, who had insisted on coming with them. As best he could, Diego told them about Grandfather, and I tried to talk about what I had just seen in the hallway, but they didn't seem to pay attention. Suddenly, amid the sadness and confusion, a ghostly vision seemed even a silly thing to worry about. Only Lucia seemed to have paid attention to me, and while Raphael and Javier tried to convince us that we were affected by Grandfather's death, and that everything was a nervous crisis, Lucia walked without saying anything to the candle room. I shouted, "Don't!" when I realized what she was doing. She took a candle, approached us, and with one blow extinguished it. Diego turned to her incredulous and shouted, "I thought that's what I thought at that moment when I heard the scream, but I realized it was a sound that at first seemed like a scream, then a cry, and then something guttural. While we all turned around trying to identify the source, it changed to something even stranger, a kind of hoarse growl so deep that we could feel the vibrations in our chests. When that sound stopped, the dining room light on the other side of the courtyard turned on, and we saw a silhouette run in. I'm sure I had to be imagining that silhouette, that impossible silhouette. At first glance, I could have sworn it was a thin man without a shirt, but when running and entering through the dining room gate over 7.5 feet tall, that silhouette ducked as if it wouldn't fit. I was about to ask the others if they had also been able to see it when Javier and Raphael ran out to the street. Diego ran to Lucia and lit the candle that was still in her hands. "I have to stay," Diego repeated as if trying to calm himself. When I asked him what he was referring to, his answer frightened me. Although not knowing exactly what was happening, he would have to stay in that house to ensure that the 33 candles remained lit, just as Grandfather had said. And I knew I couldn't leave him alone. That's how the worst week of my life began. It was a Tuesday around 6 p.m. when I arrived with a suitcase to accompany Diego, who had already settled in since that morning. No one seemed to care. All the uncles thanked us for looking after the house, except for Uncle Roberto, who Grandfather and Grandmother had decided to leave the house to, for being the last to leave it, and the only one who hadn't been able to buy his own. This seemed unfair to the others, though they didn't dare say so, fearing that somehow we were trying to get their inheritance or something. Uncle Roberto surprised us that night when he arrived at dinner time and settled into Grandmother's room. He brought dinner for the three of us and tried to pretend he had come to the house in a friendly manner. His presence, rather than inconveniencing us, made us feel that it would not be possible to investigate further about the room and what we had seen on the day Grandfather died, especially with him sleeping one door away. The three of us talked at length until midnight, and as in a movie, we were surprised by the sound of a clock in the hallway leading to the bedrooms, but whose bells reached every corner of the house. At that moment, as if hidden between that sound, I clearly heard something fall. It was a dry thud like someone falling out of bed. In my imagination, the sound came from the candle room, but it could have come from any of the bedrooms. I looked at the others. My uncle didn't seem to notice it, but my eyes met Diego's. He had heard it too. Uncle Roberto got up to go to the kitchen, and Diego approached me. "I've changed several candles, but I kept them in Grandmother's room. We need to get them out of there. I noticed they're burning faster than normal. I don't know what that could mean." We remained silent when my uncle returned. He said goodbye to us and went to sleep, and the two of us, each lying on a sofa, couldn't help feeling afraid about what we had seen days before entering this same living room where we were now. We tried to sleep, but I couldn't stop looking at the complete darkness forming in the corners. Just when I was starting to doze off when I felt my eyes heavy, and for a moment began to dream a noise in the central courtyard made me open my eyes again. A loud noise as if something was running among the flower pots, moving them. The large window connecting that courtyard with the living room where we were opened slightly from outside, and I clearly heard something jump inside. I wanted to think it was a dream because I was terrified by the idea of the angel in the garden moving, and many times as a child I had had nightmares where it chased me all over the house. I felt so afraid that my heart actually hurt. Then I looked at Diego on the other side of the room, eyes almost bulging with terror and signaling me not to make any noise. Right after, and almost without moving his finger, he pointed to his right. In the hallway near the large window, I'm sure of what I saw then. I can swear by the memory of my grandparents. It was the silhouette of the angel looking at me with that angelic smile dimly visible in the darkness. Suddenly, with a jump, Diego stood up shouting and ran towards that silhouette, which disappeared in a movement running along the hallway, and we heard the footsteps clearly until they were lost in the bedrooms. Then the door to my grandmother's room where my uncle was. We ran and met him in the hallway, terrified, in the middle of the 3 doors. Someone just went into your grandfather's room. I thought it was one of you, he said. Meanwhile, I was trying my hardest not to look at the courtyard. Unfortunately, the figure in the center could be seen from every possible angle in the house. I think more than being afraid to see it at that moment, I couldn't bear the idea of turning around and finding its place empty. We were like paralyzed, all 3 of us, until Diego slowly opened the door. It had barely opened a few centimeters when someone pushed it violently from inside. My uncle screamed in fear, perhaps all of us did, and ran to the kitchen shouting that he was going for a knife and would see who was in there. Diego took advantage and opened the candle room. We saw that 1 candle was out. He ran to grandmother's room, took out the candles, and lit one, replacing the extinguished one and placing the others in a corner. Meanwhile, I heard laughter coming from inside my grandfather's room, laughter that suddenly stopped. My uncle ran past me, knife in hand, and flung open the door to grandfather's room, searching everywhere but finding nothing inside. We spent the next hours until dawn, telling him everything that had happened since grandmother died, and the connection we believed it had with the candles in that room. "We need to go to sleep," my uncle said. "This afternoon we'll think about it." I spent the entire afternoon from 11 a.m. when I woke up resolving issues from one place to another in the city. At times I forgot everything. At times my life was like anyone's, like that of the people around me, or at least that's what I wanted. Around 5 p.m. I headed back to the city center of the old quarter, thinking about what awaited me in the evening at my grandparents' house. When I reached the gate, I met Doña Esperanza, a woman who had helped my grandparents with household chores during their final years. She blessed me and hurried away. When I entered, Diego was loading gallons of water onto the dining room table along with strange artifacts, crucifixes, and Bibles. "You scared Doña Esperanza," I told him. "No, she brought all this," Diego said. "I just thought that this didn't bode well." I asked him what she had said. Uncle Roberto interrupted, saying I shouldn't worry, that they were just incoherencies and fantasies of the old woman. "What do you think?" I asked Diego. "After everything that's happened to us here, are we going to say she has fantasies?" "She says they're goblins," Diego replied. "She says she's seen them run from the courtyard to the candle room. She doesn't know what's going on with that room either. When she came to help the grandparents, it was already like that. I crossed the house to the living room to drop off my things." The story about goblins sounded absurd, but in that house, in that place, under those circumstances, the thought of anything out of the ordinary was enough to make me shudder. And that damn angel was smiling at me in its normal position, but with something different on its face. "Miguel, all right, we're going to do an experiment," Diego said. "Look at this." I didn't like those words from Diego at all. Uncle Roberto opened the door to the candle room. He took a small candle and blew it out. The lights flickered for a moment as if there was an electrical overload, and the flames of the candles trembled as if someone was breathing near them. I felt a chill in my back, as if coming from the long hallway. Despite the lights being on, due to the way the house was built, it always kept particularly dark corners and nooks. Nothing happened, my uncle was about to say when we heard footsteps on the roof. very heavy footsteps that shook the walls around us. In a panic attack, my uncle lit the candle and placed it on the table. It didn't take 2 seconds for the footsteps to stop. "They want us to keep them lit. We'll leave them like that," my uncle said. "Whatever they are, they get angry when we turn off the candles. Tomorrow I'm going to call the priest." He locked the candle room and took his things. "Stay here if you want, but don't go in there anymore. I'll see you tomorrow." Saying that, he left just as he had arrived. Diego, however, didn't seem to be paying attention. He seemed focused. "I don't think they're angry about the candles," Diego whispered. I didn't understand at first, so I asked him. "I don't think they're angry about the candles," he repeated. "I think they prefer them turned off, don't you think? There are 2 more candles about to go out, at least the ones I can see from here. Let's see what happens in this time if they go out." Saying that, he returned to the kitchen and started sprinkling holy water all over the house. I didn't know how safe it was to stay there, but I knew I couldn't leave him alone. So I called Javier. The truth is, I didn't want to be alone. Javier reluctantly agreed to come, though it scared him a lot. He arrived around 10 p.m. "There's a lot to do in the store," he said, and I knew it wasn't an excuse. Javier helped his father run a small grocery store they had. That's the address of the house. I know all this is very hard to believe, but what happened that night, specifically what I'm about to say, can be confirmed by the people who live next door and across from the house. You can go there and ask whenever you want. We were having dinner on bread and milk when Javier arrived a little later than he had promised. He tried to convince us to leave to let Uncle Roberto handle it if he wanted to stay with the house. "It's not who keeps it, but what's kept in it," Diego said. "This was our grandparents' house. We all have memories here. We all grew up here. It belongs to all of us, not to whatever is in that room." "Maybe we weren't the first ones here," Javier objected. "Maybe they were here before." We remained silent for a while and tried to finish dinner. A while later, a deep sigh seemed to come from the candle room. "There's a candle about to go out," Diego said to Javier. "We want to see what happens if we leave them like that." A murmur began to echo throughout the house. Diego and Javier walked toward the hallway, and I got up to put my plate in the sink. And when I came back, the murmur had become clearer. It seemed to come from the plumbing. I don't know if it was in another language or if I couldn't understand, but I couldn't help but look at the pipe. I removed the protective mesh it had, and the murmur stopped for a moment as if it had been caught. Then a moment later it continued as if nothing, and I could almost see an eye emerging there inside. That's my imagination, I thought, and nervously I walked toward the hallway to find my cousins. Then I realized someone had turned off all the lights. Only in the kitchen where I had been was there light. Another sigh came from the room. Another candle, I thought, and ran toward the hallway. When I turned to go to the living room area and the hallway, I saw what looked like a woman running towards me, a woman wearing a wedding dress. Again, I have to tell you that it was very dark, and it could have been anything but. I only remember that instead of continuing, I turned right to the waiting room leading to the street and got there. I wish something had changed at that moment, that when I went out, everything had ended and life continued normally, but the truth is that the heavy and gloomy atmosphere seemed to flood everything, to flood the entire street. The only thing I could think of was to run and knock on the door of the neighbor across the street, Carmen. I liked her. I trusted her not enough to knock on her door at 11:30 at night, but at that moment I didn't know what else to do. Carmen had tried her luck in the USA since she was old enough to work. She earned enough money to buy a property on the street when she returned to the country and gradually restore it. She wasn't even 35 and was already fulfilling her dream. I repeat, I liked her, and at that moment she was my only way to find an escape from the house. When she opened the door, I realized I hadn't thought of an excuse. I asked for her phone because I had lost mine and said I needed to make a call. She told me to come in while she looked for her cell phone. I noticed her discomfort due to the hour, but there would be time later to apologize. She asked me how I'd lost my cell phone, and I told her that the power had gone out in my grandparents' house. "Oh, look," she said, pointing to the window of a living room facing the street, a room that was also closed most of the time, and that my grandmother used for knitting, one of her most entrenched hobbies. The silhouette of my grandmother was perfectly drawn at that moment, using the sewing machine so clear through the curtain that it seemed to have a spotlight behind it. That silhouette suddenly turned towards us, and from the gate of the house I saw Diego and Javier running towards us. The silhouette stood up and changed completely. I can assure you that it was wearing that wedding dress, that it was the woman I had seen earlier in the hallway. Although Carmen doesn't know anything more about what happened in those days, and obviously we never shared everything with her, she is a witness to what happened at that moment of that silhouette, and the fact that it had been in that room all night. And that night, none of us could go back. My mother went to get some things from the house. I didn't find out until the afternoon. I asked her why she went without telling me, and she replied that she didn't need to announce when she was going to her parents' house. Obviously, I couldn't say anything. My mother had been with my cousin Lucia all morning, and they had both gone there. "Did you see anything strange?" I asked. "Besides the mess, you all left nothing. The house did feel very cold, and I saw what the grandparents did with the room you all keep talking about. It's even scary, and all those lit candles are a hazard." "The candles?" I asked. My mother told me that Uncle had gone in and lit some. She told me as if it were unimportant, not knowing all that it meant to us. At that moment, I sent a message to Lucia through Facebook to ask her what had happened and why she hadn't told me anything. "Tomorrow I'm going early to grandparents' house with my brother," she replied. "See you there." In front of the grandparents' house, very early, around 7 a.m., the people living on the street were doing their traditional cleaning in front of their houses, a moment they usually took advantage of to chat. The air was filled with the fragrance of the morning. For a moment, standing there in front of the door without daring to enter, I missed my grandmother more than ever, even when looking from here at the opaque window of the living room that she used for knitting. I could almost see her figure as each time I visited. The sound of Carmen's house gate opening caught my attention, and when I saw her come out, I approached to apologize for the way I had behaved with her the other night. "Sorry about the other night, Carmen. I really wish I could explain, but it's complicated." She smiled at me and said I shouldn't worry and promised we would talk later. We never did. She walked down the sidewalk toward the main street, and from her door, Doña Marta, her mother, came out. I wanted to apologize to her too, for fear that I had awakened her that night. "I won't ask why you did it," she interrupted me before I knew what to answer. "You think I won't believe you, but the neighbors have been commenting on things about your grandparents' house for years. But I always thought they were superstitions of older people. I don't know what's going on there or what's been happening with you and Diego these days," she continued. "But I hope you know that your grandmother is still there in the house. I don't know if she's stuck with you or protecting you, but she's there in the house." I froze. I turned back to look at her window, and there in the darkness, in the dim curtain, I could almost see her face. And I knew that perhaps I was imagining it, that it was my desire to see her, but deep down, I was sure that whether it was or wasn't what I was seeing, my grandmother was still there. "I see her pass by the windows facing my house," Doña Marta told me. And it never scared me, but rather created a strange fascination because I was a skeptic until then. The commotion woke me up on Wednesday night when it happened. I looked through the window to make sure everything was okay. When your cousins ran out with you behind them, I could see your grandmother. It was the first time I saw her clearly, as if she were flesh and blood. Until then, I had only been able to see her silhouette through the windows. Just as Doña Marta was telling me this, I saw Javier's car turn onto the street. It stopped in front of the house and let Lucia and Rafael get out. Javier signaled for us to wait while he looked for parking. Before entering, I said goodbye to Doña Marta, wondering if what she had just told me was something I should share with my cousins. I had many questions whether my grandmother was there to protect us or if she was being forced to remain in the house and live among those things that had taken over the place. Lucia told us that she had heard her mother talking on the phone the night before. It seemed that Uncle Roberto had decided to sell the house as soon as it was in his name, something that didn't leave the others at all satisfied. "Come on, I want to see something before Diego arrives," Javier told us, and we went into the house from the courtyard. The angel greeted us macabre as always, but I noticed that this time I wasn't the only one trying not to look at it. "Every time we turn off a candle, something comes," I said, and just as I said those words, a terrifying idea passed through my head. What if my grandmother was suffering? What if she needed one more candle lit for her so she could rest? At that moment we realized Lucia wasn't with us, and we started looking for her all over the house. Finally, we found her turning the kitchen upside down. She was looking for something, and had finally found it an old business card of Don Mateo, the man who did all the repairs in the house. Lucia explained to us that the day before a 16-year-old boy had come by who spoke with Lucia from the street door. He kept looking in as if trying to see inside and specifically asked her if everything was okay and if they needed any repairs in the room at the end of the bedroom hallway. He said he was Don Mateo's son, so he must know something. Lucia hurried out as soon as she told us this. To my surprise, Diego was already waiting for her outside, and they quickly left while Lucia dialed the number on the card into her cell phone. "Come on," Raphael said, drawing our attention again. "We need to see if this is true." I knew Raphael needed to see it himself, that it was difficult for him to commit to what we, the others, said, and tried to investigate if he hadn't seen something himself convincing enough to rule out any rational explanation. I told them I would lie down for a while in the living room while they did their experiments. I knew they were going to turn off candles and wake up, so to speak, some of the things we had already seen. So I took one of the blankets we had left in the living room, and with quite a bit of fear, placed it over the angel in the garden. Almost as soon as I lay down on the sofa, I fell into a deep sleep. I began to dream many strange things that I remember seemed terrifying, but forgot upon waking. Between dreams, between nightmares, I felt someone shaking me, pulling me violently to wake me up. I thought it was one of my cousins that something was happening. But when I opened my eyes, I saw a woman with horrible black hair covering her entire face, a woman who was shaking me while she was on top of me. At that moment, I swear to you, I felt as if my heart stopped working. I closed my eyes and squeezed them, and instantly I stopped feeling her on top of me. I have to say, of all the things that happened there during this week, this is one of the things that made me feel most in danger, but at the same time, it's the one that still causes me some doubts. I know very well that it could have been sleep paralysis, but what happened next, however, I know for sure is completely real. The light coming through the window, increasingly faint and by the direction, made me look at my watch and see that hours had passed. It was after 4 p.m. I slept much longer than I thought. Next to me on the floor was the blanket I had placed over the angel. As soon as I saw it, I ran as if the devil was taking my soul to the bedroom area, calling my cousins, but no one answered. When I reached that room, there were about 5 candles out. I didn't know how many, but I tried to light them and replace those that had burned out. When I finished crying, coming from Grandfather's room caught my attention. Worried because I knew nothing about my cousins, I went into the room. The crying came from under the bed. I observed from there standing and had no idea what was under there. I bent down, and when I lifted the blanket, I realized it was Javier hiding under the bed and crying nonstop like a child. I stood up and asked him what had happened. He kept asking me about Raphael. We went out to the street. I left him in the small grocery store a few meters from the house and went back to look for my other cousin. I went all over the house but found nothing except a horrible stench that flooded every corner of the house. When I returned to Javier, he told me that he had just spoken with Raphael's mother. Raphael was at home, This is very strange because I never knew what happened to Raphael that day. Honestly, I never saw him again, and months later I heard he had left the city saying he was going to study in Guadalajara, but he didn't even register for university. Even to this day, he still doesn't. I lost almost all contact with him because he doesn't even connect to Facebook anymore. Javier's case, however, was very different, but we'll get there. I received a call from Diego after spending the entire afternoon looking for him. He had convinced Don Mateo's son to talk to him and Lucia. Don Mateo completely refused to talk to Diego or Lucia, but the son was more understanding when he saw their desperation. "Miguel, it's very important that you don't stay in the house after it gets dark, but check that the candles are still there and leave there," Diego told me. Although, as I said, I had just lit the candles, a great doubt began to form in me. What if there was a candle about to go out that I hadn't seen? Now, thinking about it, it was completely irrational. But at that moment I felt that something could happen, so I went back and quickly entered the house. I turned on the lights. I was invaded by sadness when thinking that now I was afraid to enter a place that had been my second home for so long, a place where I had so many memories. The sadness was replaced by fear, but I felt clearly that something was pressing on my chest. The candles were in order, but something told me that one could fall and cause an accident, a fire. It's very strange, I know, very difficult to explain, but it was almost as if a voice had put all those doubts in my head, although I don't remember a voice telling me that. I put a bucket of water under the table. If something happened, it would be good to have water there, at least that was my logic. I went for a glass of water and placed it on the table, then I went for another and placed it there too. Then another one, then another and another, and I lost track of time until, when I was bringing one more and stopped, I saw that the table was full of glasses as many as candles, and behind the table behind it was the most horrible figure I have seen in my life. There, standing at the end of the room, was a man or something with a humanoid shape that seemed to be completely covered with what looked like wax or something similar. It was as if it was covered with scales, and although in its head I couldn't distinguish any human fraction, I guessed a smile when it looked at me, and with that smile and a movement of its hand it extinguished 2 candles on the table. I ran out. It was an image so clear, so precise, so sharp as nothing I had ever seen in my life, as clear as I can see the computer screen when writing this. When I ran outside, I noticed something in the courtyard. A silhouette next to the angel, and I only saw it out of the corner of my eye, but it was a silhouette that I can almost swear was my grandfather. My grandfather sitting next to the fountain as he used to do, but this time he was bending over as if to touch his stomach, as if it hurt. When I saw that and was about to turn to look at it head on, it seemed that the shape of the angel approached him as if to embrace him. That's all I remember. And then I woke up in Javier's car. I don't know how I got there, but I did in worse condition than he was a while ago. I don't even know how, but after a few minutes we arrived at his girlfriend's house, who was having a party or a gathering. We stayed there in silence and shock, but somehow we felt protected, or at least that's how we felt, being among many people living their completely normal lives. We spent the night, and on Saturday afternoon we met Diego at my house. He had stopped by my grandparents' house earlier to check that room and said that whatever it was, everything felt worse and worse. Javier at that point apologized to us and told us that he couldn't and didn't want to continue and wouldn't allow us to continue either. Diego then decided not to tell Javier what he now knew and gave us a clearer idea of what was happening in that place, or at least what had caused it. If he doesn't want to get involved in this anymore, that's fine, really. It's not necessary for Javier to have to live knowing it. Then Diego told me the story. The next day, Uncle Roberto would finally go with a priest to the house. A known priest whom he had managed to convince to visit and bless the house after Sunday Masses. "We're going too," Diego told me. And that Saturday night, the saddest I remember in my life while we had coffee, Diego told me the story of Don Mateo. Don Mateo seemed reluctant to tell the story from the first moment he realized they hadn't called him to offer a job. They had just gotten his address like that. However, it was evident that he knew exactly what house Diego was referring to on that street, my grandparents' house. He also knew very well that both grandparents had already died. And later we found out that it was he himself who had asked his son to go check how everything was, but for some reason he refused to share what he knew with my cousins, perhaps because he saw them almost as children. After leaving his house disappointed, thinking they wouldn't achieve anything, they ran into Don Mateo's son, who was returning from completing a small job. A disease of his father had gradually diminished his ability to go out to work, and the young man was increasingly taking complete charge of the family business of repairs and simple maintenance services. For that reason, even though he was still extremely young at the time, almost a child, he had to know exactly what had happened in my grandparents' house, which probably triggered everything that came later. It all started as a routine repair. A house as old as this needed constant maintenance, so it wasn't strange for the grandparents to call Don Mateo whenever a new problem appeared. This repair, however, would require more heavy work, especially breaking a floor and excavating, so Don Mateo brought his son and two of his helpers to assist him that weekend. Suddenly, after digging about a meter looking for where a pipe leak ended, they found a small chest. Occasionally in the courtyard they had found valuable things buried, something common in houses that had gone through the Revolution. Like on that other occasion, they would wait for the grandparents to open the chest and check it. However, when they took it out, they noticed other things covered with cloths underneath a deeper chest and more cloth bags containing something inside. When the grandparents arrived, they entered that room to check, and Don Mateo asked his son and his helpers to leave. The boy, disobeying, stayed to observe through a crack in the door. When they began to discover what was wrapped in the cloth, my grandparents' expressions went from expectation to concern, and then almost to disgust. They continued taking things out of the cloth bags one by one and placing them on that old wooden table. The boy couldn't see what they were taking out, and eventually they came to the two small chests. My grandmother's scream when opening the first one must have flooded the entire block. The fright made the boy run to the garden, hide behind the angel, and from there he saw my grandmother run out and go to the other side of the house toward the kitchen. There she began talking on the phone. The boy, hoping not to be seen, approached the room again, but now faced an already closed door. He only heard my grandfather say over and over inside, "It can't be, it can't be." And he also heard his father, Don Mateo, asking my grandfather to calm down. When they returned from the break, the other helpers, Don Mateo, asked them to leave and his son to wait in the kitchen. That little while they promised him turned into complete hours until it got dark, and then several men arrived at the house. Due to the familiarity with which they spoke, the boy believes they were friends of my grandfather. They left shortly after taking with them everything they had found, and Don Mateo told his son it was time to return home. He didn't say a word in the car, but halfway he stopped in the middle of a dark street, got out, and Don Mateo vomited, screamed, and with eyes full of tears returned to the car again without saying a single word, not even a look. When they arrived home, he only asked his son to enter and not say anything to his mother, and he stayed in the car. After a while, he entered and went directly to the bedroom without dinner. This is all the young man knew with certainty, but small comments he heard afterward, conversations between parents, disjointed words made him suspect about what was found on that occasion. They looked like hands. They were real, human. That it seemed to have the shape of a baby. Phrases without connection, unrelated words that he heard his father say while sleeping when he had nightmares. The young man told him, "I don't really know exactly what they found there, my father and I." He returned to finish that work alone, and since then he became ill. Afterward I had to go make repairs in that house, but I never knew exactly what happened. I never really knew what they found. but I know that they awakened something. Since then, everything there changed. While Diego told me what the young man had told him, I couldn't help but look at him with surprise. I never imagined my grandparents in that situation struggling with such things. They seemed so calm, but I didn't understand why Diego was starting to shed tears as he shared this he had just been told. "That's right, isn't it?" I said. "Your tears seem exaggerated, as if out of place. What's happening, Diego?" He looked at me seriously and replied, "I spoke with someone else. She told me in confidence the stories of who lived before in the house grandfather's family. I don't know if you want to know, Miguel. These are things that for some reason they never shared with their children, much less with their grandchildren." When he said that, I knew there was no turning back, so I asked him to tell me, and Diego told me about our ancestors. He told me stories about the occultism that some practiced at the beginning of the 20th century there through the revolution, which turned out to be terrible for thousands of people in the country, trapped between two sides, two factions that would not yield or grant anything, and who did not care about the innocent. Then he told me two stories from the 1940s and 1950s, that time of supposed progress for the country, and in which that house, our house, seemed to remain in time. There were several stories so incredible that they were even shared in chronicles of the time. One of them was the story of the revenge that a soldier swore against his master, a ruthless landowner who tortured the laborers and raped their women. When the revolution broke out, a young laborer who had seen how that horrible man tortured his older brother to death swore that he was going to kill him and do with his daughter what he did to the women of the laborers. About to fall into the hands of the insurgents, this landowner managed to escape along with his little girl with the help of one of the nannies of the child. This man, as evil as he was, had very good trusted friends in this city, among them my grandfather's family. He asked them to hide in the house, but they refused. They told him it was impossible for them to risk the entire family just for him. They agreed, however, to keep his daughter until he found another place to put her safely. Weeks later, they had to abandon the house to take refuge in another city, as it was too dangerous for them to remain there. But at the time of leaving, this girl did not appear anywhere. They searched for hours throughout the house and on the street, asked in houses around, but nobody saw her. Being impossible to wait, they left. When they eventually could return, almost a year later, they looked through windows and doors and found the girl's corpse, but she had died only 2 months before, according to what the doctor told them. That meant she had spent months completely alone, feeding on who knows what, in complete darkness, in complete agony in that same house. In the 1930s, an older brother of my grandfather had dropped out of school at an early age. They secluded him in that room at the end, isolated from everyone else. Over time, the siblings began to worry. He screamed at night, cried all day, asking to be let out, and when finally the parents allowed it, it was only to seclude him in a convent. The siblings never heard from him again. When hearing the stories, I made the same connections in my head that Diego surely had made, but neither of us dared to say them out loud. He told me many more stories that were shared with him in a context completely outside of what we would think of as paranormal stories that his mother told him, as talking about the eccentricities of people from another time. But for us all, this was terrifying. Each detail could mean something important. When we arrived, Uncle Roberto was in the house with 2 priests. We talked with them for a while. It seemed extremely strange to us how understanding they both were, and how they didn't seem to doubt our accounts of the things we had experienced there. "You would be surprised by the things we have to deal with sometimes," one of the priests told us, the oldest. The other one, whom I remembered having seen at my grandmother's funeral dressed in civilian clothes, was very serious, but seemed to know more about the matter. He told us that my grandmother had told him certain things that happened in that house. I know that at some point things began to happen here, and holy water and what I once did to help them was not enough. Then your grandmother turned to something else, another type of belief, and she told me about it very regretful, hoping that I would forgive her. When he finished saying that, we looked at him with confusion. Perhaps noticing it, he clarified, "Don't worry, your grandmother wasn't particularly Catholic or religious, so it's not a confession secret or anything like that because she shared it with me in a chat. But I think it's now more important that you understand what was already happening then." Then they proceeded to bless the house and pray in each of the rooms, but he was very clear, "We have done this before and it didn't work then." Although at the last moment Diego had decided not to tell Uncle Roberto anything about what we had discovered. When the priest left, my uncle asked us to stay for a while as we had coffee. He told us he had a plan. He had to stay that night and would appreciate if we did too. Before agreeing, he told us to wait while he went out for a moment. He returned accompanied by a girl about 30 years old, very short, with short hair. She brought with her a board. At first glance, I might have said it was an Ouija board, but unlike any I had ever seen before. "Make yourself at home," Uncle Roberto said to her. "Prepare whatever is necessary." Diego asked what was going on. At that moment, someone calling my name caught my attention. I was in the living room, and that voice seemed to come from the kitchen completely dark. "Miguel!" I heard it clearly again. Someone was calling my name. So I slowly approached, and just barely illuminated by the moonlight slipping through a crack in the curtain, I could see the silhouette of a woman, a familiar silhouette. "Miguel," my uncle called me, "go get something for dinner while we start preparing everything." He gave me some bills, and I went out still dazed, still hearing that voice that came from the kitchen and somehow could feel it throughout my entire body. I remember very well that when I returned with the food on the street of the house of my grandparents' house about 40 or 50 meters from me, I could see that silhouette again. The silhouette I had seen in the kitchen. The silhouette of my grandmother, but young and thin as I had never known her. The light of the street lamp right in the middle between us was strong enough to shine on me and hide her behind that illumination, but I could see her. She was there, just standing there looking at me. The moment I thought about talking to her, just thought about it, she turned around and completely disappeared into the darkness. That was the last time I saw her, or thought I saw her. I'm not sure of anything that happened during this stage of our lives, but of the very, very few certainties that I have, one of them is that on that day, my grandmother and I made peace, and she made me see that somehow she was no longer linked to that house or those candles and all that inhabited it. And finally, seeing her outside was complete peace for me. When I entered, I was surprised to see Diego, Uncle Roberto, and the younger priest, who had been with us in the afternoon, observing from outside the girl preparing her board in the candle room. "Do you really think playing Ouija here is a good idea?" I asked, very angry. "It's not an Ouija," my uncle said while putting his hand on my shoulder, "and well, to this day I don't know what it was, but as I understood more than to contact spirits and have them answer your questions, this other board is like a tool to guide the dead to provide them support from this spiritual plane." "We're going to give this a chance," Diego told me. "According to what the priest told us the last time, between the grandparents, Don Mateo, and the mother of this girl who is now beginning to burn incense, they had managed to contain in that room whatever it was that had begun to invade the house since they found the chests. Almost everything is ready," the girl said. "At midnight we're going to begin." I don't know if the girl really knew what she was doing, but there was a mixture of practices that I found disconcerting. There were Gregorian chants, Our Fathers, and prayers in Latin, religious figures of all types, and a box of candles that gave off a horrible stench even when they were out. "This is going to take a long time," she told us. "With these candles, I'm going to try to attract what inhabits this house. One candle for each presence, but these candles are of living flesh, and when they go out, they will never appear here again. Living flesh." I don't know what she was referring to, but that was the expression that remained tattooed in my memory. The priest gave us his blessing and said he would be nearby on the street if we needed anything from him. I supposed then that we had exceeded the limits of what even a modern and liberal priest like him could tolerate. The girl asked my uncle to take a candle from the room and then go out with it. "When I tell you, you're going to put it out," she said. My uncle entered nervously, came out seconds later with a candle, and walked to the entrance of the house. "Put it out," the woman told him, and he did so with a breath. The tallow candles that the woman brought wouldn't light. She put one match after another, and they were consumed before they could light them. I heard a scream from my uncle, and then how he ran out to the street. A little later, he would tell us that while standing in the reception when he put out the candle suddenly, his reflection in the mirror began to become more opaque until the point of being just a stain, while he heard us farther and farther away, as if we were more distant. That stain that was his reflection suddenly turned into a woman in black, who in the blink of an eye was in front of him trying to grab his chest. He lit seconds later. That's why he escaped to the street where everything seemed to return to normal. The candle lit moments later, and then it was my turn. Actually, it was Diego's turn, but I was so afraid that I wanted to end it as soon as possible, so I took a candle and went out. I froze in the hallway against my initial plan, which was to run to the kitchen, one of the most illuminated places in the house. Before the woman gave me the indication, something blew out my candle. I don't know if it was an air current or something else, but when I walked through the dark hallway out of the corner of my eye, I saw the silhouette of the angel starting to descend from its place, and I was petrified. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed that when I walked again, when I took one more step, this thing moved again. Only like that while I was walking. And then I also saw next to it, sitting on that fountain, the silhouette of my grandmother, and each step I took, that thing got closer and closer to her. But something inside me told me that my grandmother was safe, that my grandmother was out of there, and gathering courage, instead of running straight to the kitchen, I turned around to run right toward the courtyard, right toward the figure of the angel. And when I saw it face to face, I realized that the figure was in its place, that there was no one else there, that everything was perhaps in my head. Diego told me to return. "The candle is already lit," he said. He entered the room, took a candle, and went out. I noticed it was a slightly heavier candle, one that was in the center one that I didn't remember changing. It barely fit between his two hands, and I remember very well his look, the look of Diego just illuminated by that candle. He looked at me and smiled as if he were a child about to play a prank, as if for a moment it wasn't him. The lights were off. The only thing that allowed us to see beyond our eyes was the light from the candles inside the room and from the matches of the girl nervously trying to light the candle that he was carrying. Suddenly she screamed and her candle fell to the floor, breaking into pieces. Extremely heavy and strong footsteps, like those of an enormous animal, were heard in the room. In the shadow cast by the candles, I could see something that looked like, let me say, a billy goat, as if it were standing in the middle of the room. There was a snort, and all the candles in the room went out. We were in complete darkness. Have you heard that recording of the sounds of hell? That sound they accidentally recorded in an excavation several kilometers deep. Something very similar began to sound from inside my head at that moment, while Diego and I illuminated with matches as we ran to the room before closing the door. I saw the hallway filled with blurry figures, silhouettes walking slowly towards us. When the light of a candle lit up behind me, I could swear that one of the figures stopped. I don't know if that happened with the other figures, but what I had just seen had me dizzy because they were like people out of focus, as if I couldn't see them completely. We lit one by one not only the 33 candles, but all the candles in the room and the horrible-smelling ones that the woman had brought. We could only light 18. We never found the rest. Nothing was ever the same. The woman told us she didn't know how to solve the problem after that attempt and asked us not to call her any more if we had to go to that house. The priest, who was supposed to be outside, had vanished. I never knew what happened to him or if he was a real priest. Uncle Roberto inherited the house, and before they were even in the papers, he was already renting it as an office for a government agency. I don't know if with that room and all, I don't know if the candles are still there, and that agency only stayed there for a very short time, so the house is empty again. Uncle never told anything about what happened, and when Diego dared to tell Uncle Roberto, denied everything, leaving Diego as a liar, worse still, as unbalanced. Diego, in fact, was treated for bipolar disorder depression, and the last thing my aunt told me is that they were starting to give him medications common for patients suffering from schizophrenia. I never denied anything Diego said, but they didn't ask me directly either, and after seeing how they treated him, I decided not to tell anything within the family. Only some of my closest friends know, as well as Lucia. Lucia continues to make comments about it, but her sarcastic character is such that nobody seems to take her seriously. I've seen Diego so bad recently, and Uncle Roberto seemed to ignore everything so easily that I have asked myself more than once how much was true, how much happened in my head. Perhaps I should go back and see that room. Lucia's constant calls remind me that in reality we witnessed something terrible. I'm very ashamed to say this, but I think I have to. After a very clumsy suicide attempt, everyone except Lucia and Diego began to treat me differently. I can't explain. I would be lying if I said I tried to do it because of what happened, because of what I'm telling in this story. And I won't bore you with all the details, but I feel that somehow this influenced, in a percentage, albeit a very small one. The things in my life entered a terrible stage, and since what we went through in that room, I feel as if something is consuming my energy, as if something constantly, day by day, is consuming my energy. I'm open to all your questions and will try to answer as best I can. Once again, I tell you, I hope you don't demand too many explanations because I don't have them. I wish I had them. I wish I understood. Do you build theories about this? Do you try to find meaning in all this chaos? God knows I've tried. Last night I received a call from Lucia. She was in a state of panic that I had never heard before. She screamed that she had seen Raphael. I tried to calm her, saying that perhaps Raphael had returned to the city. But Lucia said, "No, Miguel, you don't understand. I saw Raphael, saw him that night, the last night in the room. He tried to extinguish all the candles. They caught him, Miguel. And last night, I saw him standing outside my window, his face. Oh God, his face." She went silent after that. I called back multiple times, but she didn't answer. I drove to her house, and the front door was wide open. Inside, I saw wax footprints leading into Lucia's bedroom. On the wall, written with something that looked like dried blood, was a line: 33 candles must burn. This is the 32nd. Only one more to go. I couldn't find Lucia anywhere. But as I ran out of the house, I saw a familiar figure standing at the end of the street under a streetlight. It was Raphael, his body distorted, covered in dripping wax, smiling with an unimaginable smile. And beside him was the small figure of Lucia, her hand slowly reaching out toward me, her eyes empty. I ran back to my car and drove away, not daring to look back. Now, sitting here telling this story, I feel very cold, although the temperature outside is 86 degrees. And last night at 3 a.m., I received a message from Diego's number. "Brother, I know what we found under our grandparents' house. It wasn't statues, it wasn't sacrifices, it wasn't a ritual. It was them, 33 entities, from long before we were born. The legend calls them Los Consumidores, the consumers. And when the candles go out, they are free. I've seen Raphael, I've seen Javier. I'm next. You're the last one, Miguel. Run and hide." I haven't heard from Diego since then. Right now I'm sitting in a hotel 200 kilometers away from the city trying to understand what happened to us. But there's only one thing I know for certain, that 32 candles have gone out. And I feel tonight will be the last one.